Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of The Snake Pit. I'm your host, Son of Bat, and tonight I'll be talking about House of Wax. Released in 1953, House of Wax is an American mystery horror film directed by Andre de Toth, and of course starring the legendary Vincent Price. Released by Warner Brothers, this is in fact a remake of the studio's own 1933 film Mystery of the Wax Museum, which conveniently enough is included on this DVD, which you could probably see in the thumbnail. I'll get more into that a little bit later and the specs of the DVD, but Mystery of the Wax Museum and House of Wax, for all intents and purposes, are pretty much the same movie. The dialogue is almost one-to-one and the plot is pretty much the same. But the main difference is Mystery of the Wax Museum takes place in what would be present day, so about 1933 when the film was released, whereas House of Wax was made in 1953 but takes place in 1900 and 1902. So, slight difference, nothing major, but this is in fact a remake, and it's actually not even the first remake in this series or franchise, if you want to call it that. Those of you listeners out there probably already know this, but those of you who don't, there was a loose remake in 2005, also called House of Wax, and it's more like a slasher movie. Pretty interesting. I won't go too hard into it, because hopefully we'll review it at some time on the channel, but this movie has two remakes, one of which from the 50s and one from 2005. And the 2005 one is most known for Paris Hilton catching a pole through the back of her head. I mean, most of you from the early to mid 2000s probably know her for catching a pole down the throat, but in this one she catches it like right through the back of the head and out the fucking face. And the marketing around it was this spring, come see Paris die, or like March 6th or May 6th, come see Paris die. And I remember that being a huge selling point. It's pretty funny, but it was also a pretty good movie. But we're not talking about that one today. We're talking about the Vincent Price classic. And interestingly enough, I didn't know this until I did some reading. This movie pretty much saved Vincent Price's career, because up until this point, he was like a background or a side character in a lot of his movies. He wasn't really given top billing or whatever you want to call it for those olden Hollywood land times. But this movie pretty much revitalized his career and set the path for the movies we'd later see, like, The Abominable Dr. Phibes, The Tingler, more of his mad scientist roles, like The Mask of Red Death. I think that was one of them. I need to catch up on my Price movies, but this pretty much revitalized his career in the horror genre and cemented the legend and the icon that we know today, which I thought was pretty interesting. And like I said, didn't really know that before. Something interesting I found about this movie is it's actually the first 3D color film from a major American studio. The first black and white 3D film from a major studio was Columbia Pictures' film Man in the Dark, and it was actually released 2 days before House of Wax. So thought that'd be some interesting film history for you guys there. Some of you listeners may or may not know the 1950s was a huge time for, gimmicky shit in horror movies, theaters, drive-ins, stuff like that. William Castle was the definite pro of it, but there was other directors and shit and studios more specifically capitalizing on this gimmick. However, Andre de Toth was actually blind in one eye, so the optics of 3D wouldn't work for him, and he really didn't give a shit about it. He was more focused on making a character-driven, good, scary, creepy horror movie. And he succeeded, because this movie works totally as a 2D movie. There are a couple 3D moments, or moments you could tell were shot for 3D, but it doesn't take away from the whole film at large. In fact, it's kind of charming, it's kind of interesting, it's definitely a product of its time. But you can tell that Andre de Toth was more interested in making a good movie instead of making something where he's just throwing a bunch of shit at the audience. And, I think it worked out, because it really is cool. Some of those movies, well, fun, they are really hokey and really gimmicky. This one still holds up as being kind of creepy at times, pretty serious and pretty tragic, grim. It's a cool movie, but definitely not a victim of its gimmicky times, whatever you want to call it. But I thought that was pretty interesting. Again, this movie in 1971 was re-released with the 3D. I guess people really wanted to see it. It's something people do get interested in, but they get really bored of it quickly. Again, a decade later in the 1980s, it was re-released again with the 3D, I think, to capitalize on the revitalization, because at that time you had Amityville 3D, Jaws 3D, and Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D. A lot of Part 3s in 3D. Fucking try saying that a bunch of times. I mean, I already had a few takes doing it, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, why don't we get into this movie? House of Wax, released in 1953, directed by Andre de Toth, screenplay by Crane Wilbur, and based on The Wax Works, which is an unreleased short story by Charles Belden. Hope I said that right. Produced by Brian Foy, and of course starring Vincent Price, Frank Lovejoy, Phyllis Kirk, Carolyn Jones. For those of you who don't know, Carolyn Jones was the original Morticia Addams in the 1960s rendition of the Addams Family. Pretty cool to see her here. And Paul Percerni. Actually, this also has the beginning career of Charles Bronson, but in this movie, he's credited as his original name, Charles Buczynski. Still really crazy seeing Bronson without the Death Wish mustache and shit in it, but he plays a deaf mute named Igor in this. Pretty cool. Cinematography by Bert Glennon and Pervel Marley. Edited by Rudy Fair. Music by David Budolf. Distributed by Warner Bros. And released on April 10th, 1953 in New York and April 25th, 1953 in the United States as a whole. Running time 88 minutes, so relatively short. And, of course, released in English with a budget of $1 million, but with a box office return of $23.75 million. So this movie made a fuck ton back. This was a blockbuster. I've actually heard that the original promotional run, they had a then kind of out-of-work Bela Lugosi to stand at the premiere of the movie with another actor. I can't remember what his name was. Let me just look for it right here. Steve Calvert, and he was in a gorilla suit, but apparently that didn't blow over too well. Kind of sad, but interesting film history for any of those of you who are interested or give a fuck. But anyway, set in New York during the early 1900s, talented sculptor Professor Henry Jared runs a wax museum. It features historical figures, some of whom have met some grisly ends, such as Abraham Lincoln or Joan of Arc. However, his business partner Matthew Burke wants to dissolve their partnership due to Jared's refusal to make sensationalist or exploitive exhibits such as a Chamber of Horrors. The reason why Jared won't make a Chamber of Horrors is because he believes it goes against the beauty in his art. He only wants to make scenes of joy and life, at least for the most part, because the Abraham Lincoln one is right after the assassination, and the Joan of Arc one is right before she's about to be burned at the stake. So, aside from those two pretty grim ones, for the most part, he wants to make, more upbeat, lively sculptures. Now, the problem with upbeat and lively, beautiful sculptures is they're not making any money. Hence why Matthew wants the Chamber of Horrors to be made. Essentially, this is a disagreement that spirals, but before it spirals, Jared tells him, look, I have this wealthy art critic who's going to come in, and he more or less is interested and will probably buy all of this shit, so we're pretty much good. Everyone will be happy in this deal. But things don't go as smoothly because Sidney Wallace comes by, and while he is very interested in the undoubtable talent in Jared's work, he says he has a business trip in Egypt he has to go on, and he won't be back for 3 months, so therefore he won't be able to make the decision until he returns in 3 months. That's not enough time for Matthew Burke, who was listening the whole time. After, Sidney leaves, he basically tells Henry, look, why don't we just burn the fucking place down and split the insurance money? There's like at least $1,200 in each wax figure. We can split it down halfways. A big fight ensues. Henry, basically is like, absolutely not. You're not going to kill my children type, craziness. They get into a huge fist fight. All the while, Burke is like lighting these wax figures on fire. Eventually he knocks out Henry Jared, douses him in kerosene, and lets the whole place go up before it finally fucking explodes. A really interesting side note about this. So the fire scene in the beginning of this movie is actually, it was supposed to be 3 controlled fires that would start and, gradually go, but it spiraled out of control in real time. So, they were filming this whole set, bursting up into flames. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but Andre de Toth, he just kept rolling the camera. He didn't want to lose any of the shots because those wax figures were, in fact, really expensive, and they didn't have the time to remake them that quickly. So you're seeing a real disaster get caught on film there, but they rolled through it like a pro, and it came out pretty fucking cool. I mean, it's a very interesting, very, very striking scene. Some of those figures are pretty creepy, especially when melted, but pretty interesting, crazy behind-the-scenes story there. But so obviously the wax museum explodes, and it's assumed that Henry Jared is dead. After this, Burke obviously receives the insurance money, and he's about to, live at large with his new soon-to-be wife, played by Carolyn Jones. However, before he can cash or spend any of the money, he's murdered by a disfigured man in a cloak. Another side note here, I thought it was pretty interesting. Now, my history could be a little off. I could be wrong here. Did Giallo movies start in the 50s or did they start in the early 60s? Because to my recollection, they started in the early 60s. I mean, it could be the late 50s as far as I'm concerned, but I thought the only reason why I bring this up is because the killer in this movie, he looks a lot like a Giallo killer, which I thought was pretty interesting. If it's a proto-Giallo thing, that's really cool historically. But if Giallo movies were out before that or during that, it's nothing really too special. But I think it's interesting that an American movie had a killer look like that. What I mean, for those of you who don't know, he's wearing a black cloak, black hat, black gloves. His face is crazy. It actually kind of reminds me of The Burning a little bit. The effects in this movie, especially for the killer, were really fucking crazy. Those of you probably know who it is, but spoiler alerts, all that shit, blah, 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 blah. We'll get into it later. But anyway, Burke's murdered, and it's pretty much staged as a suicide. Shortly after, his soon-to-be or would-have-been fiancée, Kathy Gray, is also murdered, but this is interrupted by her roommate, Sue Allen. What results is chase through the darkened streets, which is pretty creepy, pretty cool chase scene. She hides out at her friend Scott Andrews' home. While she's hiding out, the murderer goes off into the morgue and ends up stealing Kathy's body, where it is taken away by not only the murderer but his two assistants. I think later we actually get an intermission, which kind of surprised me because this is a pretty short movie, but I believe the reason why there was an intermission is because this is when the reel change for the 3D reels come in. But so there was an intermission, and then basically we're reintroduced to the art collector Wallace, who happens to meet Jared, who, surprise, surprise, has survived the fire, but he's now wheelchair bound and unable to sculpt because his hands have been horribly burned and disfigured. But it all works out because he has two new assistants, a deaf mute named Igor and an alcoholic named Leon. Igor is, of course, played by Charles Bronson, which I mentioned earlier. He decides to kind of bend the knee for public taste, and he's decided to make a chamber of horrors showcasing many acts of violence, including the apparent suicide from Burke, which has so far gone unsolved. Pretty on the nose, you can see where it's going, but it's pretty interesting. Now, when the museum's opened, Scott and Sue end up going as a sort of date, but Sue is really freaked out because she thinks the Joan of Arc mannequin looks a lot like her roommate Kathy. Now, Jared, is quick to explain this, saying, "Oh no, I saw pictures of her in the newspaper in her obituary, and I was moved. She's very beautiful, and I just had to use her face for the thing." And, Sue's like, "Creepy, but okay, thanks." But he tells her, Henry tells Sue that she looks a lot like his old Marie Antoinette wax figure that burned up, and he would just love to, have a sculpt made of her, have Leon and Igor do it. But yeah, so, she agrees to it, kind of, but not really. And as things go on, people start becoming increasingly suspicious of the waxworks, Jared, and his two assistants. I mean, Sue Ellen's pretty much suspicious the entire movie. Scott's actually hired as the third assistant to the waxwork because he's kind of a retard and he doesn't really see what's going on. But Sue Ellen insists that, something's not right, and her suspicions really, start going into full gear the first time she takes a good look at the Joan of Arc figure, not only resembling Kathy, but it only has one pierced ear, just like Kathy. She mentions this, and Henry brushes it off as, aside from her being very pretty and using her face for the sculpture, he noticed that she had the one ear piercing, and, he didn't intend to, it just was the picture. But, Sue Ellen kind of politely brushes that off, how could you see a tiny piercing like that? The other thing that kind of raises a red flag is for a guy who's, all about historical accuracy and detail, why would he put one ear piercing in Joan of Arc if, back in those days, a girl would have two ear piercings? It just doesn't make any sense. She brings this up to Scott, who tells her, "Hey, let's just go to the police and bring it up." They're the three guys, the two cops and Scott, kind of just humor her and, for lack of a better word, they laugh at her. "This crazy broad thinks there's dead bodies in the waxworks. All right, sure, boss." But one of the cops actually kind of has a snap into reality, and he's like, that guy Leon, there's something not right about him. There's something I recognize about him. Maybe I sent him away because I never forget a face. I forget names, but I never forget a face. And sure enough, the cop's intuition's right, because that is a criminal who's breaching his parole and he's under a fake alias. So they arrest him, and to try to get an answer out of him, they exploit that he's an alcoholic, and they start slowly pouring a drink in front of him, getting him to crack. It's pretty fucking wild. But while that's going on, Scott's adjusting to his new job at the waxworks, helping out with Igor. He gets sent on an errand. I think the reason why is because Henry wants to like set a distraction so he can get Sue Ellen alone, and basically, you know, he sends Igor to go dispatch him in case he comes back. When Sue Ellen comes to the waxworks, she realizes the big finale, the big reveal that, you know, Henry is not crippled, and he's actually quite bitter, and he stands up, she hits him, and this is a great reveal where she starts hitting him in the face, and his face crumbles like Vincent Price's face crumbles like a wax mask, because it is a wax mask. He's the burnt, crippled psycho strangling people earlier in the movie, and it's such a great reveal. The monster looks fucking phenomenal in this movie. He subdues Sue Ellen, and he puts her on this apparatus that's basically going to coat her in hot wax, and she's going to be his Marie Antoinette figure. You know, Scott gets put into a guillotine by fucking Igor, and his head almost gets chopped off. And I was actually reading that was a real guillotine blade they put in one take, and it's crazy. No one got fucked up, and a lot of people were pissed when that scene happened. But yeah, Scott almost gets fucking decapitated. There's a whole showdown in the waxworks, and the police basically corner Jared, who falls into the wax just like Joker and burns to death. Yeah. That's pretty much it. It's a very cool movie. You know, the wax figures look very cool. The details. It's just a very nice movie. And, you know, for 50s movies, you don't see a lot of them in color. So it looks very. I don't know what I mean. Like, I mean, I'm not used to seeing a movie from the 50s in color, so this one looks really nice. I mean, I've always really been interested in House of Wax, both the original and the remake. I think this might have even been one of the first horror movies I saw as a little kid. Like, this is definitely up there for me with like Dracula and Frankenstein and shit like that. Definitely springboarded my interest in more macabre movies. I think the reason why I saw this one was because the remake was really popular when I was a little kid, and you know, my dad used to get burnt copies of movies, and he had it. And I really wanted to watch it, but my mom was like, you know, super against certain movies. Like, my dad was the cool one, good cop. My mom was bad cop. So they had to reach a compromise. And the compromise was I could watch the Vincent Price one. And then later when mom was asleep, I watched the R-rated one with Pops. But the compromise was we went to the video store as a family. We rented House of Wax with Vincent Price, and I watched that one. And I remember it being pretty creepy when I was a kid, and it still holds up to this day. I mean, it flies by really fast. The intermission that shows up kind of in the beginning middle way is really weird, especially for a movie that's only 88 minutes. But, you know, and again, it kind of takes you out of the movie a little bit. That was my only real gripe about it. But other than that, this is a fucking classic. I mean, Vincent Price, amazing actor. I mentioned it earlier. This really, you know, was kind of like a renaissance, like a comeback resurgence film for him. Like, because after this, he got more of the mad scientist roles that we know, like the Abominable Dr. Phibes, the Tingler, you know, shit like that. And it kind of broke into like the Vincent Price we know and love today, like the legend, you know. But yeah, the weird thing about this though is he usually, and I might have to, like I said, I might have to catch up on my Vincent Price movies again, because to my recollection, he usually plays a pretty sympathetic or likable character, even in the horror movies. I mean, in House of Haunted Hill, he's kind of a scoundrel, but he's a likable scoundrel. So in my mind, all the horror movies he's in, he's like a likable, you know, kind of sympathetic person. I could be wrong. In this one, I couldn't really fit the sympathetic vibe. I mean, he's tragic, I'll say that, because he's an artist. He's very devoted to his craft, but he flies off the handle very quickly. And he kind of like, I don't want to say he deserved to get fucking burned to death or burned to a cripple in his wax museum, but he jumped off the handle really quick with Burke saying he'd fucking kill him. And like, I mean, that's probably would escalate any fight, but he wasn't very sympathetic in my opinion. He was very like bitter and calculated and cold, which is interesting because like I said, he's a very warm presence in a lot of like even the horror movies, but in this one he straight oozed villain in my opinion, which was very cool. It's always cool to see Vincent Price, you know. Again, a very cool movie. Highly recommend this one. If you're a horror aficionado, or you know, if you like old movies from the 50s, you got to check this one out. I mean, it's classic. You got fucking Charles Bronson before he was Charles Bronson. You got Carolyn Jones. You got Vincent Price. Like, what more could you want? This movie, it's classic. There's no other way to put it. Both versions of the poster, too, I fucking love. There's the original one that's like black and white with like the can girl running out of the screen and the monster chasing her. And then there's the more classic, like horror movie poster. I mean, I don't know how to say this, but the more classic poster where it's like Vincent Price's face shattered and burning with the house, and the chick whose tits are barely covered strapped to the table, like very pulp horror movie poster. I mean, this movie is a staple. It's a classic. It's fucking undeniable. And I think anyone who's calling themselves a horror fan should see this movie. I mean, sure, see the remake. It's great, but you got to see this movie. Anything with Vincent Price is usually going to get a recommend from this channel. And as for, I believe, the first Vincent Price movie on this channel, it's going to get a strong rating of, I'm going to say, 10 out of 10. This movie's a classic. It flies by fast. And if you get the Warner Brothers standard DVD, you are also gifted the additional film, Mystery of the Wax Museum from 1933, which will also get a review on the channel one day, but not today. But, yeah, no, and also if you get the oops, I dropped my DVD there. But also, if you get the Blu-ray of this, you also get the nice treat of seeing the 3D version of the film, along with getting Mystery of the Wax Museum, but in standard. Now, with 3D, I was never really bothered by it. Again, I mentioned earlier that the 3D it's not reliant on 3D with this movie. For fuck's sakes, Andre de Toth was blind in one eye. 3D didn't work for him. So there's a couple gimmicky scenes like the Barker with the paddle balls, which is pretty cool, actually. 3D aside, the fact that this guy had that much control over the ball, hitting it an inch away from people's faces, and then catching them with his mouth and shit, it was crazy. It was a real trip. There's a cool, creepy scene with a monster in 3D that I won't spoil, but I don't know. I know a lot of times I've tried to watch 3D movies. I just get a strain on my eyes. Like Friday the 13th Part 3 was the worst one for that, but that could also be just because it's a very shit movie. Again, though, this movie, don't think of it as a 3D movie if you're going to watch it. It's a movie that happened to use the gimmick of 3D because it was popular at the time. This movie was filmed as a 2D structured horror movie, and because of that, people's performances and the story shine through. It doesn't fall victim to traps of gimmicks or schlock. I mean, it is kind of schlocky, but it's a really good movie. And like I said, there's some hints to giallo films in here with The Killer. Wax museums are always cool in horror films, from House of Wax to Waxworks. It's cool shit. If you like horror, again, like I said, check this movie out. Solid 10 out of 10. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll be back to you with more horror, fucked up, or gangster reviews in the near future. See you later. Peace.